If there is no settlement, do you accept that you will probably have to fight?
Yes. Yes, I think that it is fake speculation to believe that.
You accept that if there is no settlement, then the war that you're fighting at the moment will probably be intensified?
Yes, I think that is a fair assumption.
The person you just heard speaking was the Prime Minister of Rhodesia from 1964 to 1979, Ian Smith. In 1965, the Republic of Rhodesia, led by Prime Minister Ian Smith, declared independence. This led to a violent conflict in Rhodesia called the Rhodesian Bush War, which lasted for 15 years. The Rhodesian government versus the Zimbabwean revolutionaries, the white minority versus the black majority. This messy war led to the deaths of over 20,000 people, and its consequences still shake the foundations of Zimbabwe's government and economy today. But in order to understand the conflict, we have to go back to the beginning.
Rolling down to Salisbury town, or is it my imagination? I got a past, we're moving at last, for rest and recuperation. Two bright starlight eyes will be smiling at me. Dark brown hair down, dancing, flying and free. Two warm, love-torn arms will be holding me tight.
Before 1965, Rhodesia was a colony under the rule of Great Britain and was led by a white minority government, as with the rest of the British African colonies. These colonies oppressed the black majority, and the whites owned much of the land and wealth. However, the British Empire's firm grasp on Africa was slipping, and they began to give their colonies more autonomy and power. In fact, after World War II, many of the empires in Africa began to lose their grasp on their colonies. So the British Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson, stated that decolonization in Africa could only happen with majority rule, meaning that the white minority in Rhodesia could not rule. However, the Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith desired a white minority rule, so he and many of the white Rhodesians wished to propose a negotiation in order to avoid the inevitable. The negotiation would be that the ruling power instead goes to the wealthiest, because the whites were the wealthiest, being only 8% of the population and owning over 70% of the land. The British government declined, and so Ian Smith made the unilateral Declaration of Independence, making Rhodesia a republic in November of 1965. However, with British pressure, no UN states recognized the new country.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there.
How did you manage to find this man?
Telling me
Well,
I got to.
Even before the unilateral Declaration of Independence, Rhodesia faced conflict in and around the territory. We have to keep in mind that the Rhodesian Bush War occurred during the Cold War. For context, after World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States were the only superpowers that remained. A competition ensued, and they competed for global dominance, which often led to several proxy wars. Rhodesia was no exception. The Soviet Union and People's Republic of China funded several groups in Africa in places like Angola, Algeria, Ethiopia, and Mozambique. After the Sino-Soviet split, China and the Soviet Union competed for influence in Africa. They both funded revolutionary groups, which brings us to the belligerents. The Rhodesian military at its peak had over 10,000 regulars, 15,000 reservists, 8,000 police, and 19,000 police reservists. They also received limited military support from apartheid South Africa, receiving 2,000 to 3,000 additional troops. The Rhodesian military received volunteers from Britain, South Africa, Portugal, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. Canadian, Australian, and American volunteers were held with high regard for their recent Vietnam War experience. The Rhodesian military, considering the arms embargo set by the UN, were well armed. The standard infantry rifle was the Belgian FN FAL rifle, but the Rhodesian military was armed with other weapons as well.
It looks as if really not that much has been accomplished. I mean, you've more or less agreed to disagree on a date for independence, but other than that, you don't seem to have made much progress, particularly with the white Rhodesian delegation. Why is this?
The man in the previous video was Robert Mugabe, leader of the ZANU party. Another important figure that we have to take into account is Joshua Nkomo, leader of the ZAPU party. Together, they worked to liberate Zimbabwe from Rhodesian rule. However, despite the united front against Rhodesia, they constantly butted heads, which would lead to future ethnic conflict. The Soviet Union supported ZAPU with weapons and training, and the People's Republic of China supported ZANU. ZANU had strong ties to the Liberation Front of Mozambique and was led by Robert Mugabe. ZAPU was an anti-government force based around the Ndebele ethnicity, led by Joshua Nkomo. In contrast to ZANU's ties with Mozambique, ZAPU was based in and had close ties to Zambia. Both ZANU and ZAPU were armed with Russian weapons.
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste. I've been around for a long, long year. Stole many a man's soul of faith. I was around when Jesus Christ had his moment of doubt and pain. Made damn sure the pilot washed his hands, seal his face. Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name. But what's puzzling you is
Before we get to the war, it's better to understand a little bit of context. From 1956 to 1959, the white minority government made sure to ban all representation of the black majority in the government, and even increased bus fare prices to limit the amount of blacks who rode the public transportation. With the white minority government banning party after party, a group of people of the black majority formed the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress, or the S-Rank for short, led by Joshua Nkomo. The Rhodesian white minority government banned the S-Rank in 1959 and arrested 307 leaders on February 29th in Operation Sunrise. Nkomo was lucky enough to be out of the country at the time and was not arrested. Nkomo, Mugabe, and other activists formed the National Democratic Party, which was led by Joshua Nkomo. The NDP lost the next election in a landslide to an even more conservative Rhodesian Front Party. Nkomo vouched for continued ZAPU leadership in the NDP, and Mugabe and the others disagreed. The party split, and Mugabe formed the ZANU organization, which took a more militant approach for equality. In July of 1964, ZANU forces assassinated a Rhodesian Front Party official. The war had now begun.
way from your hometown, but you can have yourselves a ball with your muckers. Goodbye, Bulawayo. Dodgy says on square. It's a long, long way to Mukambura, and we're going up there to stir. It's a long way to Jokinyanga.
The Smith administration detained Nkomo and Mugabe after the attack, and so the ZANU and ZAPU guerrillas engaged with Rhodesian military at Sonoya, which was the first major battle of the war. The war's intensity heightened after the unilateral declaration of independence, and the bitter conflict continued for several more years with brutal events taking place. In 1976, after the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in Africa, Mozambique closed their 800-mile-long border with Rhodesia due to the conflict reaching Mozambique because of the ZANU bases in the country. Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith realized this added a new front for the escalating war, and so Rhodesia launched a brutal offensive into Mozambique in hot pursuit raids to destroy the nationalist camps. The Rhodesians were losing the Bush War, and by now it became clear that their goal of postponing an inevitable end to the white minority rule was now no longer a viable option. They began resorting to chemical warfare. They poisoned water supplies along guerrilla travel routes in a desperate attempt to reroute the guerrilla forces. As the conflict was now increasing in intensity, the United States and Britain made an attempt to reach a peaceful resolution in Rhodesia. However, the Rhodesian government refused to give up white minority power, and the black Zimbabweans were divided amongst each other in their feudal, tribal, and political differences. From 1977 to 1979, the war took a drastic turn of events and several attacks on civilians occurred. Militants bombed a department store in Salisbury, modern-day Harare, the capital of Rhodesia, killing 11 and injuring 70. In May of 1978, 50 civilians were killed in the crossfire exchange between Marxist militants on the Zimbabwean side and the Rhodesian military. In September of 1978, Nkomo's ZAPU forces shot down a Rhodesian civilian aircraft with Soviet-supplied heat-seeking missiles. 38 died in the crash, and the remaining stayed at the crash site. Eventually, ZAPU forces found the crash site and promised to help. After robbing and beating them, they finally cut them down with automatic gunfire. 10 more of the civilians on the aircraft were killed during the massacre. ZAPU forces shot down another civilian aircraft in February of 1979. There were no survivors. All 59 passengers plus crew on board were killed. Rhodesia retaliated heavily in another desperate attempt by initiating an air raid offensive against the ZANU and ZAPU militants. They began airstriking strategic bases in Zambia and Rhodesia. As the months continued into 1979, it became evident that this war was already lost. The ZANU and ZAPU guerrillas were multiplying, and the Rhodesians could not hold them back.
The end of 78. Inside an African compound, angry drums beat out a New Year message. Bitter words.
Our children are dying of hunger. Food is what we need. Conditions are getting worse. We may as well be dead. We hope our children will have a better future.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end of our elaborate plans, the end of everything that stands, the end, no safety or surprise, the end. I'll never look into your eyes again. Can you picture what will be so limitless and free, desperately in need of some stranger's hand in a desperate land?
The long and bitter conflict finally ended in 1979 with the Lancaster House Agreement. The white minority government would give up their power and allow for free elections. Presidential elections that followed saw the success of Robert Mugabe's ZANU party, and eventually he himself became the president of the new Zimbabwe, up until he was finally impeached in 2017. The story of Rhodesia is that of two losing sides. Two sides who believed they were doing the right thing, often losing sight of their morality and judgment as a result. The Rhodesian government believed they were defending their Western values and protecting the most prosperous nation in Africa. The black majority believed in liberating their people. Both sides ended up committing horrible atrocities. Zimbabwe was met with hardship as soon as it received its independence. Robert Mugabe was a crooked president who served as a dictator. Multiple fraudulent elections would take place under his rule. The Zimbabwean economy would tumble, and multiple massacres would occur because of ethnic and political differences. There were no winners to this conflict, and there is no bright future in sight for the coming years in Zimbabwe. Rhodesia would provide an example to the world of what would happen if disagreement between races and ethnicities were to come to the worst possible scenario: war. Ethnic conflicts can and have led to some of the most brutal and horrific wars in mankind, and Rhodesia was no exception.